Bom dia a todos, todas e todos. Iniciamos a segunda e última semana de transmissão do 15º Congresso Internacional de Estética Brasil, Estética e seus Sentidos, uma parceria da Associação Brasileira de Estética com a Universidade Federal da Bahia. Good afternoon, Professor Georg Bertram. Thank you very much for kindly accepting the invitation made by the Brazilian Society for Aesthetics and by the Federal University of Bahia. Both institutions are partners to organizing the 15th International Congress of Aesthetics Brazil, Aesthetics and its Sense. Let me briefly introduce you to our audience before passing you the microphone. A conferência plenária de hoje ficará a cargo do filósofo e professor Georg Bertram, titular de Estética e Filosofia Teórica, junto ao Instituto de Filosofia da Universidade Livre de Berlim, onde ele estreia neste semestre letivo o Graduierten Kolleg, Normativity, Critique and Change, um programa temático de formação, inclusive de doutores e de pesquisas, financiado pelo Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. Entre os vários artigos e livros, muitos deles traduzidos para o inglês, espanhol, italiano e coreano, destacam-se Kunst als menschliche Praxis, eine Ästhetik, Arte como Praxis Humana, uma Estética, pela editora Suhrkamp, em 2014, publicado em inglês pela editora Bloomsbury, em 2019. O livro Was ist der Mensch? Warum wir nach uns fragen? O que é o homem? Porque nos perguntamos por nós, pela editora Reclam, em 2018, e em outubro deste ano lançou, também pela Reclam, Improvisation, Lob der Ungewissheit. Improvisemos, um elogio da incerteza. O título da sua conferência será Improvisation as Paradigm for Art's Potential to Intervene in Society. Lembre que uma versão rascunho da tradução está disponível em link no final da mini-bio do autor, aqui mesmo no YouTube. Professor Bertram, welcome, please.
Miguel, thank you very much for your kind introduction, and thank you all very much for the kind invitation. I feel very honored to be part of your Congress in aesthetics, and even though I would have loved to be with you in Brazil in presence, it's clear that in the moment it's good to have at least this possibility of sharing something, and this indirect digital form of being present to you is good. So what I have been preparing for today is part of general reflections on artistic intervention, which I pursue in the moment, and Miguel already mentioned this monograph of mine, Kunst als menschliche Praxis, Art as Human Practice, on which the reflections to be presented today build. So this is a background, and what I present today aims at developing further the account which I have presented in the book. And I have some of the most important sentences of the presentation on slides, and the slides will now start as I start to read the presentation. Fantastic. My presentation addresses the question of how art has an impact on human practices. If we aim at understanding how art is relevant in historical cultural contexts, we have to understand the ways in which art is part of these contexts as a whole. How does art manifest itself in other fields of human practice? What are the mechanisms by which art is effective in other fields of human social practice? These questions prompt us to investigate 2 points. On the one hand, we have to ask how art can intervene in other practices. At least in the Western tradition of the last 3 centuries, we are used to thinking about art as a practice that stands on its own. The concept of aesthetic autonomy has often been invoked in order to articulate the independent character of art. If we want to give an account of art's potential to intervene, we have to explain how aesthetic autonomy is inherently bound up with heteronomy. In which ways is art oriented towards being effective in the non-artistic realm? On the other hand, we have to conceive of historical cultural context in such a way that art can have an impact within them. Very broadly put, how must we understand human forms of life if we want to give art a place within them? In which sense is everyday life open to interventions of the arts? How is it possible to understand everyday human practices as being shaped by artistic interventions? The questions collected thus far bring me to the concept of improvisation. I think we should view human forms of life as entailing an essentially improvisational dimension. This allows us both to consider art as being effective in relation to human practices and human practices as being open to interventions made by the arts. In order to explore how art is embedded in everyday social practices, I will construct an analogy between art and improvisation on the one hand and society on the other. The analogy between art and improvisation is guided by the idea that both involve impulses that prompt reactions. In the case of an improvisation, impulses are realized during improvisational practices. In the case of art, impulses are realized through artistic objects or artistic practices themselves. What interests me most about the analogy between improvisations and art is what we might call the logic of intervention. I understand intervention in a broad sense. They encompass both critical and affirmative ways of exerting an effect on other practices. If we want to investigate art's potential to intervene in society, i.e., in social, historical, cultural practices, two aspects are of particular importance. First, an essential dimension of these interventions is their potential to realize something that is unexpected or new. Second, what the interventions realized manifests itself in reactions to them. In other words, reactions to interventions are what make them real. We have to account for the structure of interventions or impulses and reactions in order to illuminate art's potential to intervene in everyday practices. As to art's potential to intervene in society, a remark may be helpful. During the last decades, we have experienced different artistic movements, like social art, participatory art, institutional critique, etc., which could be understood as aiming to produce art that has a social impact. The theories of Nicolas Bourriaud and Claire Bishop, just to mention two prominent art theorists, have tried to build new conceptions of art as a primarily social practice by drawing on these movements. It is not the aim of what follows to develop an aesthetics of social art. Nevertheless, I think that social art, participatory art, and so on encourage us to develop philosophies of art that try to explain how art intervenes in society. In line with these preliminary reflections, the following argument will proceed in 3 steps. First, I discuss basic aspects of improvisation. I want to outline some important aspects of the theory of improvisation that are essential for better understanding what I call the logic of interventions. Against this background, I investigate, second, the ways in which theorizing improvisation may help us to better understand artistic practices. I want to sketch an answer to the question of A, how interventions are realized through works of art and artistic performances, and B, how the interventions are inherently bound up with recipients' reactions to them, in such a way that they inform non-artistic practices. Third, I thematize the social dimension of artistic interventions. I want to give at least a brief account of how one might concretize artistic interventions with regard to social structures. This should shed light on the everyday aspect of artistic interventions as well. So you see, I have 3 parts. The following reflections have 3 parts, and I will start Now with the first part on improvisation. Improvisation. I want to start my preparatory reflections on improvisation and improvisational practices with a short example. It is the dance performance or musical performance without music, both sitting duet by Jonathan Burrows and Matteo Fargillon from 2002. The performance allows us to grasp important aspects of improvisational practices, which I will try to explain on the following slides. If one wants to gain a conception of improvisation, 4 characteristics are of particular importance. A, its interactive dynamics. B, the necessity of preparation in order to be able to deal with what is unprepared. C, its evaluative dimension and the normative structure of improvisation. And D, its qualities of unexpectedness and uncertainty, i.e. the ineluctable possibility of its failure. And I want to go a little deeper in all of these 4 characteristics. So let me briefly elaborate. The interactive dynamics of improvisation are evident in the example both sitting duet. In an improvisation, we are confronted with actions that belong to an interactional structure. What one of the performers does prompts reactions from the other and vice versa. Think of a jazz quartet. The trumpet player introduces a melodic line that is taken up by the piano. Another possibility is that the piano answers with a different melodic element. This kind of interactional dynamic is even realized in a solo improvisation in which the improviser engages in dialogue with themselves. We can better grasp this interactional structure by saying that an improvisation is made up of actions that have a two-pronged structure. On the one hand, the performers, musicians, etc. react to something. On the other hand, they themselves provoke reactions. Thus, interactions in an improvisation have what I call an impulse and response structure. Again and again, impulses given in an improvisation call for a response. In this sense, impulses pose a challenge for those who have to respond to them. If every action within an improvisation is both an impulse and a reaction to an impulse, then such actions are at once both acts of reception and acts of production. Someone who improvises can only succeed if they not only produce actions, but are, at the same time, receptive to the actions they are reacting to, be it their own actions or those of others. In this sense, production and reception coincide within an improvisation. The importance of production and reception in improvisational practices allows us to appreciate the second characteristic, which counteracts a common misconception about improvisation. One tends to think that improvising is acting out of the blue in a situation one is not prepared for. Thus, improvising seems to imply not being prepared for what one is confronted with. But this is not true. Someone is only able to improvise if they are prepared in multiple ways. Improvisation is a practice in which the improviser is prepared for the unprepared. Improvisation is misconceived if one understands it as a practice of simply responding to something unexpected. This would mean neglecting the essential importance of preparation to improvising. Because production and reception are entangled in improvisation, the preparation necessary for improvisation includes both skills of production, of reacting, and skills of perception. Those who improvise have to react to impulses they are confronted with. In order to be able to react, they have to develop their skills of reaction. And in order to be able to grasp the impulses adequately, they have to develop their skills of perceiving something unexpected. Think of someone who is only able to perceive patterns they have been trained to perceive. This would make improvisation impossible. Improvisation presupposes that subjects have acquired skills that allow them to perceive something they are not familiar with and to translate what they perceive into something productive for their own reactions. The two-pronged structure of actions and improvisations has another consequence. Every response in an improvisation is evaluative in nature. It evaluates the impulses it responds to. By evaluation, I mean that the response values the impulse of the call as providing, for instance, a good idea, as making real and interesting exception, as provoking a break with the rules that have thus far guided the improvisation, etc. By responding, the improvisers give an implicit assessment of what they are responding to. But the evaluation can always be in the negative. It can set up a conflict, or it can be expressed through the sheer absence of an answer. The evaluative dimension of improvisational practices allows us to understand the normative dimension of improvisation. An improvisation is a practice in which normative structures are established on the spot by what is played or improvised. Think again of a jazz quartet. Maybe the drum proposes a rhythmic structure that the piano adopts. If the structure is prolonged, it can be regarded as a norm to which the improvisers adhere. The norm in question is established within the improvisation itself. It is established through the repetition of structural elements by the improvisers. Or think of both sitting duet, the example which I raised in the beginning. By raising his arm in a specific way, Jonathan Burroughs establishes a new impulse that may become a norm of the improvisation if it is picked up by Matteo Fargione. A norm that is established like this could be prolonged through many actions within the improvisation. It could also serve as a norm in other improvisations, but it is always possible that no one responds. If this happens, no norm is established. The last characteristic of improvisations I want to shortly comment on concerns their uncertainty. Improvisation is constitutively confronted with the possibility of failure. This possibility can never be shaken. It is always possible that the challenges that impulses in an improvisation pose are not met with adequate responses. In these cases, the improvisation as such can fail. But it would be a mistake to think of improvisation's uncertainty as being basically problematic. Rather, it is an achievement. Through the process of an improvisation, the improvisers are confronted with unexpected impulse. Their skills of perceiving these impulses and reacting to them are decisive for the generation of something unexpected. But one cannot deal with something unexpected in a secured way. Dealing with the unexpected is inextricably connected with uncertainty. This is what I call the productive potential of improvisation. Its achievement consists in the path it opens for dealing with the unexpected. In this sense, an improvisation is shot through with uncertainty. So this has been the first part to give you a basic, some basic traits of a concept of improvisation, and I now come to the second part where I would like to connect these reflections on improvisation with some general reflections about art, from improvisation to art. It is important not to confuse the concept of improvisation that I employ here with improvisational practices in the arts. By inquiring into whether improvisation can be taken as a paradigm of art, I am not primarily interested in artistic forms of improvisation. Doubtlessly, many works of art are not improvisations. My interest concerns the ways in which we interact with works of art, be they artistic improvisations or not. My claim is that our interactions with art bear all of the characteristics of improvisations. Why are interactions with works of art of specific interest? Why is it not possible to conceive of these interactions as cases of general forms of interactions with objects or symbols within the world? An explanation of the specificity of art, often thematized as art's autonomy, might refer to art's original normativity. Works of art establish their own normative structures. Adorno calls this their law of form, their own language. Even if a work of art belongs to an art form, like the novel, or an artistic movement, like 19th century naturalism, it does not share its own specific language with other works of art. The specific normative structures realized by works of art help explain what we might call the challenge structure of art, or we might as well say the impulse structure of art. Since every work of art realizes a language of its own, those who interact with it are never wholly prepared to understand it. The basic situation of a recipient is to not know how to make sense of what she is confronted with. In this sense, every work of art poses a challenge to those who interact with it, i.e., those who experience it. The challenge is not a primarily cognitive one. All forms of cognitive disclosure of what one is confronted with rely on normative structures that are shaped in social contexts. If one does not know something, one has to apply one's conceptual system to it, or change the system in question. But this way of dealing with something unknown does not help in the case of works of art. Because artworks establish normative structures on their own, they refuse to be disclosed through concepts. Thus, it is important to understand this kind of challenge as being practical in nature, analogous to improvisation. A work of art consists in the challenges it poses to practices of seeing, hearing, bodily moving, etc. We could say that a work of art forces those who engage with it to relearn how to see, to hear, to move, etc., on the basis of what the artwork confronts them with. Think of famous examples like paintings of Edouard Manet or Paul Cézanne. Their paintings cannot be appreciated if one relies only on how one sees in everyday life. As Maurice Merleau-Ponty stated, they confront us with a new optical world, which we can only disclose by learning to see anew. But how should we conceive of the practices of seeing, hearing, moving, etc., engaged in by those who interact with works of art? A common explanation, like Adorno's, proposes that they be seen as mimetic practices. Adorno's argument can be summarized as follows. Since a work of art realizes a language of its own, the only way to understand it is to follow its structure. We have to adapt to the structure of the artwork. Even though I think that Adorno's proposal grasps an important aspect of what it means to interact with a work of art, I also think it is problematic. If one understands the practices by which recipients and producers interact with a work of art as mimetic, one tends to overlook the dialogical character of the interaction. Recipients have to respond to the impulses they get from the structures realized in the work of art. My proposal is to analyze the challenges realized by artworks in analogy to impulses within improvisations. To build the analogy, we should turn back to the concept of the unexpected. Because of its challenge structure, art has to be understood in terms of the unexpected in the sense that is pertinent to improvisation. Works of art are challenging because they confront recipients with unexpected constellations. Because of this, they are impulses the recipient have to react to. Three aspects characteristic for improvisation are helpful for further understanding the improvisational dimension of our interactions with artworks. Firstly, The passivity of following an artwork's constellation is necessarily connected with activity. By responding, recipients are productive. Thus, there is a coincidence of production and reception in the reception of artworks, just like in improvisations. Improvisational activities can only be successful if they are defined by an attentiveness to the impulses they react to. Every genuine improvisational activity is inextricably bound up with passivity. This holds for interactions with works of art as well. You cannot follow a work of art without being active, but the activity in question must be bound up with the passivity of following this work in its structures. Secondly, responses to impulses do not stand alone. Recipients of artworks are directly or indirectly confronted with other recipients who react to the responses. Through interactions with works of art, change of receptive reactions are formed. We might think of Gadamer's concept of history of effects of Wirkungsgeschichte here. A response realized by an activity that follows an artwork is an impulse that calls for further responses. Thirdly, reacting to an artwork and seeking to answer to the challenges it poses presupposes faculties of perception and reaction. If someone who is confronted with the specific constellation realized in an artwork has no ability to perceive a constellation they are not prepared for, in the sense of a new language, they cannot appreciate the artwork. In order to interact productively with artworks, individuals have to acquire faculties to perceive unexpected constellations and faculties to react to them. They do so by developing specific practices of seeing, hearing, moving, etc. To put a long story short, the confrontation with artwork can only be productive on the basis of the recipient's aesthetic education. I said earlier that the analogy between impulses in improvisations and the challenges realized by artworks can be based on the concept of the unexpected. The most important lesson of the theory of improvisation is that we have to understand the unexpected as an outcome of improvisational practices, not as their presupposition. The basis of improvisation and the reception of art is not knowing what to do, but rather learning how to not know what to do. We need to be able to unlearn and relearn skills in order to deal with the impulses generated by artworks. In this sense, the skills necessary for dealing with art have to be understood as entailing a sensibility for unanticipated events. This sensibility, which is developed with and through improvisational skills, is the basis for confronting something as something that is unexpected. We have to draw an important consequence from this and say that the unexpected is constitutively related to an ability to recognize and react to it. Now you might better understand why I claim that the unexpected is not a presupposition of improvisation. If someone is not prepared in the sense that they have no skills of recognizing and dealing with something unexpected, nothing unexpected can occur. Every improvisation presupposes intense preparation. In order to improvise, one needs skills of recognizing impulses and reacting to them productively. Or to say it with Lee Koenitz's pithy phrase, which I have already mentioned earlier on, one has to be prepared to be unprepared. Thus, the unexpected has to be understood as an outcome of art and of improvisation. 3 examples might be helpful to illuminate the improvisational nature of engaging with an artwork. The first example is Ai Weiwei's Sunflower Seeds in the version presented in 2008 at London's Tate Modern. The Chinese artist constructed a scenario that confronts recipients of, or better, participants in the artwork with the question of what to do. What is the right way to behave on the dunes of artificial sunflower seeds? Participants do not answer this question only by themselves. Rather, their answer is given through their improvisational interaction with others. A similar structure can be found in the second example, Anne Imhoff's performance Faust, which won the Golden Lion at the Biennale di Venezia in 2017. In the German pavilion, the visitors, or again, participants, were confronted with several performers they had to indirectly interact with. As the photograph shows, the performers were seen but did not allow the participants to directly interact with them. Nevertheless, they were forced to reflect on the way they moved in relation to the performers beneath the floor and other performers in the room whom we do not see on the photograph here. But I do not want to just invoke examples of contemporary performance and social art. Take the third example, which I already mentioned in passing, a famous painting by Edouard Manet, Un bain aux folies bergères from 1862. The painting confronts viewers with an optical structure that is rather puzzling. The way we see the young woman behind the counter does not correspond with how she is reflected in the mirror, together with the man who is looking her in the face or in the eyes. We as recipients have to engage in complex practices of visual perception in order to deal with the puzzle the painting presents. In this way, the painting realizes impulses to which recipients have to react by developing their practices of optical perception. I think it is illuminating to describe art's realization of something unexpected in terms of intervention. This also has bearing for the concept of improvisation. Interventions in art and improvisation are not realized through a creatio ex nihilo. As the foregoing argument underscores, the realization of interventions presupposes that artists have developed skills that enable them to intervene in some way, and that recipients have skills that enable them to recognize and engage with interventions. Against this background, we can explain the embeddedness of art in historical cultural contexts in terms of interventions. Artworks realize challenges to other practices, practices of seeing, hearing, or moving, and in doing so, intervene in those practices. The intervention in question is made possible through skills that individuals acquire within historical cultural practices. They have skills of unlearning or relearning their practices and are thus able to alter the practices and the habits they involve. The skills in question are elements of complex practices, which involve producers and recipients. Through interventions, these skills themselves are developed further. Like impulses in improvisations, interventions in and through art necessarily realize a tension between continuity and discontinuity. On the one hand, interventions only succeed if they are recognized as providing something new. They confront those who have to deal with them with something that breaks with some aspects of former practices. On the other hand, the fact that interventions have to be recognized as such implies that they create some kind of continuity. The continuity in question has double aspects to it. On the one hand, practices evoked by works of art belong to a kind of everyday practice that is further developed through the challenge the artwork realizes. In the case of Manet, it is the practice of optical perception. On the other hand, the new development of specific practices in reacting to works of art informs everyday practices of the same kind. Someone who learns to see with the paintings of Manet alters their everyday practices of seeing. The break in ordinary optical perception opens the possibility to shape a new continuity of perception that is informed by the confrontation with Manet's painting. Learning to see anew is not only restricted to the painting, but encompasses everyday situations as well. A first possible lesson of the analogy between impulses in improvisations and impulses realized through works of art is that at first sight one might think that artistic interventions can only succeed if art has a position outside of the social realm that it aims at intervening in. But the foregoing reflections help us understand that interventions can only be realized if a practice is developed in such a way that interventions can be recognized and made productive within the practice in question. Artistic interventions further develop practices and skills within a society. The improvisational character of art can be summarized by saying that art is an element of a practice of controlled self-destabilization. This is what is specific to improvisation. Improvisation is a practice that produces impulses that call for new responses and thereby challenge the practice in question. The relevance of art within historical cultural context can be explained if we conceive of these contexts as being improvisational in nature. Art is a dimension of constant self-transformation, of controlled destabilization, self-destabilization. Note that it is important not to equate self-transformation with constant change. Self-transformation can have the effect of affirming oneself in a specific activity. An affirmation like this can be based on improvisational impulses too. This is to say that an improvisational account of art's relevance within societies is not bound up with a bias towards avant-garde art. The account allows for an understanding of both avant-garde and popular art. I take it to be an important lesson of my reflections that dealing with artwork's impulses is based on individuals' skills to recognize and make productive use of the challenges they are confronted with, skills that are themselves changed in our confrontation with art. If this is correct, the contexts in question are misconceived if we take them to impose strict norms on individuals. Rather, the second nature condition of the human being has to be explained as being improvisational in nature. It is a nature of constant self-transformation and is thus structurally different from first nature. This is the end of the second part of the talk, and now I let pass some seconds before starting with the third and short last part, which concerns the formation of social structures through art. The conceptual framework provided by the analysis of improvisation helps us to better understand art's potential to intervene in society. In particular, it shows that members of a society where art plays an important role must have skills that enable them to recognize and productively engage with the artistic interventions that confront them. In this sense, everyday practices within which these skills are relevant can be understood as improvisational practices. Improvisational skills belong to particular societies or historical cultural contexts. They are a dimension of their everyday practices. In this sense, we have the first element of an answer to the question as to how we should conceive of historical cultural contexts such that art can have an impact within them. The most important element of the answer is contained in the claim that individuals have to acquire improvisational skills, skills of perceiving unexpected constellations, and skills of reacting to them. With this intermediary finding in hand, I want to take one more step and ask about how artistic interventions can be formative for social structures. Social formation is an important dimension of how arts are effective within historical cultural practices. I will not be able to give an all-encompassing account of art's potential to shape social structures. This would be much too much for a short last part of this talk. Nevertheless, I wanted to give you some ideas about how art intervenes in social structures, ideas that accentuate the everyday character of artistic interventions. My explanation starts with a short typology of how recipients react to what works of art confront them with, in the sense of impulse. Considered in the abstract, reactions as responses to impulses in improvisations and art, so primarily my interest goes to art here, have the following options. A, they take up the impulse of the action or the artwork. B, they realize some sort of counteraction. Or C, they ignore the impulse in question. While A, taking up the impulse, is associated with a positive evaluation of the impulse, and C, ignoring the impulse, may be associated with a negative one. B, really realizing some kind of sort of counteraction, can be associated with either a positive or a negative evaluation. This short typology of reactions provides us with a basis for a first superficial account of how artificial interventions are formative for social structures. Again, I think that a short typology might be helpful. A, by taking up on impulses, homogeneous communities can be formed. B, through counteractions, communities of conflict between different perspectives can be formed. C, through counteractions and ignorance, insoluble conflicts, i.e. a lack of community, can be formed. And D, ignorance can lead to social isolation. Before going deeper into some conceptual considerations, I want to refer to two examples that are situated at the border between art and everyday life. The first example is the famous press photograph Tank Man, which was captured by photographer Arthur Tsang at Tiananmen Square, Beijing in 1989. The photograph can be understood as showing an intervention in social structures by a single individual who succeeds in stopping tanks. It is an emblematic situation of intervention that is political in nature, and maybe it has no aesthetic or artistic dimension. But we should not be too sure regarding the question of whether something aesthetic is in play or not. One might, for instance, argue that what the tankman realizes is prompted by aesthetic forms of resistance, or that it is influenced by forms of dancing. But the other direction is maybe more important. The tankman has become an iconic reference for artistic forms of intervention. Among others, footage of him has been included in music videos, like the video for Michael Jackson's They Don't Care About Us. In this way, the intervention goes in both directions, from art to non-art and from non-art to art. Its social structure informs artistic practices as they inform forms of resistance in everyday life. The everyday character of aesthetic interventions becomes even more evident in the next example. I take it to be an example of forming a homogeneous community through reacting to tiny impulses of others. What you see is one of the famous crossings in Shibuya, Tokyo. The crossing is extremely crowded. At the very same moment, hundreds of people cross the streets. Thereby, they succeed in coordinating their steps such that their movements do not conflict with one another. The people crossing the street have an astonishing ability to anticipate others' movements and to synchronize their movements in such a way that they do not hinder each other. It is illuminating to see this as a complex dance. It is a choreography without choreographer that is performed by hundreds of people once the lights turn green. To view this as a dance may help us assess the artistic or aesthetic intervention inherent in it. It is part of an everyday aesthetics of Japanese culture to improvise complex social coordination in which people act in a synchronized way. Through the skills individuals acquire, a cultural self-understanding is established that can be characterized as the harmonization of individuals. The cultural practice can itself be regarded as having an essential aesthetic dimension to it. It is a practice of intervention in the sense that it contributes to the formation of a specific cultural self-understanding. These two examples help demonstrate that artistic interventions in everyday practices have the potential to bring forth both a harmonization of individual practices and a divergence of practices. Think of another example implicit here, namely a dance floor. There we experience both a synchronization of movements and the divergence from one another. If you think of battle dance, for instance, or think about a symphony concert in which hundreds of recipients experience a specific musical moment together, or think in contrast of a symphony concert in which the audience witnesses a controversial performance of some classical work. Works of art and performances of them have the potential to bring many individuals together, but they can also create conflicts among individuals and form communities of conflict. Or if individuals do not succeed in conflicting together, break up communities such that individuals become more and more isolated from one another. In this sense, interventions can bring together individuals in a collective, and they can open space for the realization of individuality. For sure, artistic interventions go way beyond giving impulses for the formation of social structures. One may object that social structures are only a marginal dimension of what artistic interventions are aiming at. Even though the objection seems justified to me, there are artistic interventions that are primarily oriented towards the tension between collectives and individuals. Maybe architecture is the most obvious art to which interventions like this belong. I want to shortly mention two examples that touch on the ways in which architecture realizes interventions in social structures. The first example is German architect Bruno Taut's famous Horsthaus estate in Berlin, built from 1925 to 1933. Hufeisensiedlung is the expression in German. The buildings are designed in such a way that a specific social structure is suggested to their inhabitants. They meet in the middle where there is room for intense social life amid artificial nature. Living in the Horsthaus estate is combined with a place for leisure activities and meeting with others. The architecture is designed in such a way that typical differentiations of modern life, like the differentiation between residence, leisure, friendship, and work, are overcome. Bruno Taut's architecture belongs to movements in the first half of the 20th century that sought to connect art and life through aesthetic interventions. Think of the arts and crafts movement or the so-called life reform movement, to which, among others, the Brücke and the artists' colony Worpswede in northern Germany belong. Taut's intervention is based on ideas formed by these movements. Compare in contrast the second example, which is also located in Berlin. It is French architect Le Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation, built from 1956 to 1958. Le Corbusier follows a quite different idea of how architecture should form social life. He is primarily concerned with the functional organization of human life. Even though his plans included a shopping street and a roof terrace, they were not realized. No space is designed as open space for meeting others and for leisure activities. The building's foyer can be used for meetings. One may say that Le Corbusier oriented his architecture towards individuals who organize their individual lives in a practical way. This ideal of social formation, the idea of social formation he follows, is informed by technological and modernist ideas. I hope that the examples are helpful for better understanding how artistic interventions form social structures. The different options characteristic of artistic interventions are not static. In different ways, works of art give impulses for processes of forming collective practices and processes of individualization. And what is most important, Like impulses in improvisations, artworks, interventions do not program social formations. What the interventions realize is inherently bound up with the recipient's reactions. Through their reactions, recipients test how to make interventions productive and how to develop adequate understandings of the potential of the impulses they are confronted with. In this way, artistic interventions prompt processes of negotiation of social structures. Here again, we may speak of controlled self-destabilization. Artistic interventions put social structures into question. Their impulses reform social structures by playing on the tension between collectivity and individuality. In this sense, artistic interventions open social structures and thus resist their ossification. In conclusion, so this is the last slide. In conclusion, I thought to show how the conceptual framework provided by the analysis of improvisation can be illuminating for understanding how artistic interventions can be formative of social structures. The most important lesson I would like to draw is that art can evoke very different social constellations, masses, conflicting communities, individuals in isolation, and so on. By evoking these constellations, works of art provide impulses for negotiating the social structures of everyday practices. The social dimension of art allows us to see how artistic interventions work. Further reflections might show how other dimensions of everyday practices are negotiated on the basis of the impulses that works of art provide. But these are subjects for different and other presentations. Thank you very much for your time and for your attention.
Thank you very much, Georg Bertram, for your wonderful presentation. Let's see if we have some questions to you. I was so attentive in following your presentation that I could not see if someone had already put some questions, but I think no, not yet. So while we're waiting for questions, I want to put two points that maybe you could stress a little more. Again, it was a wonderful presentation. I'm working on this topic since some years, and I really like it. I would like first, if you could, to explore a little more why you use recipient and not public or audience or spectators. Maybe you use it viewers and also participants, but I saw that you choose recipient as something irregular. That was the first point. It could help us also to translate it a little better for the final text, the final version. And the second point, could you please explore also a little more how you are contextualizing the improvisation in the examples you brought from the architecture? Because really, there are two examples that quite manipulate how we deal with the space. So they propose something very intense. The two examples you gave us. So there is a kind of expectation to how to deal with these impulses as you are proposing. So that's the two questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Miguel. Thank you very much. So very important questions, and that allows me to clarify. I hope at least that this allows me to clarify a little bit. So as to your first question, Miguel, why do I speak of recipient and not speak of public or audience, and so on? So I would firstly say, but I'm not sure whether that is a sufficient and satisfying answer. So I would firstly say that it's only a formal notion that I speak of recipient. So this is just to have a formal concept to build up a model of the interaction with a work of art. But I stress that recipient can be in plural. And so, for instance, if you think of an audience of a symphony concert, which I mentioned, there I would clearly say, okay, it's about an audience or a public which reacts to some kind of performance. And the audience is plural and can be built up in at least two structurally very different ways. So they can experience and feel and be affected in the very same way. So in that way, they can react together as a group which forms kind of a super individual again, or there can be conflicts. So there can be in intense conflicting perspectives in such an audience, so that that in the end there is a heteronomy in the way they build up a perspective on what they heard, for instance. So in that sense, I completely agree. It's clear that recipient in the end should not suggest that it's only one subject being confronted with an artwork and then reacted to that very artwork. That can be the case, but often it's the case that recipients stand among other recipients, and I stressed that point, mentioning Gadamer, and so that there are chains of reception, and there are lots of situations where we, as recipients, as artwork experience subjects, stand together with others and react to how they react, or build a common audience of reaction. So it's important to stress, according to my perspective, that can be structurally very different, and it's clear that it's not restricted to single subjects which deal with artworks. I don't know whether that is satisfying as a satisfying answer to your question, but maybe firstly I leave it like that. So, and as to your a second question, which I find very important, it's clear, and that I mentioned shortly in passing, that we have different kinds of artworks with regard to the question how manipulative the interventions they are in the end. Yeah, so and you mentioned these two architecture examples of mine, where you say it's clear that both Bruno Taut and Le Corbusier manipulate in a way the public, the participants in this kind of architecture, and so the proposal of how to form social structures is very strong, which these architectural works build. And then that could be part of a criticism of them already. So I think it's important to reflect that often we criticize artworks that they tend to be manipulative in this sense. Yeah, so they tend to aim at programming practices in a specific way. Or think of films. A famous example I often mention is, for instance, some of the films of Lars von Trier. So think of Melancholia, for instance. So you can think of a film like this as being manipulative, and with regard to the effective reaction of the audience. And in that way, that could already be part of a criticism, maybe being really critical about the artworks, since we could argue that they don't leave space of reacting freely to what they propose. But not necessarily we have to build a criticism up like this. So we could argue the other way around, that this is part of the artistic strength, to put it like this, that they really have a proposal and that they, in a way, force recipients to engage with that. As to the architecture, as to films of Lars von Trier, we could argue in both ways. And I think it's an important aspect of art criticism that we have to reflect on the ways in which proposals are open for really setting up negotiation procedures, or if they tend to be closed, and in that way leaving recipients no space for really dealing freely with what they are confronted with. others. So I think this is very important, and in the end, it's clear that what art does, if it really realizes what I call interventions, can't be understood as aiming to program something, aiming to manipulate something. There is, so the intervention can only happen if there is some kind of uncertainty how to adequately react to it. And that means it can't be programmed, the reaction. I hope that this is an answer.
Yes. Thank you very much. We have a question here from Rafael. Rafael is professor at the Federal University of Bahia, and he says, could you develop a bit more the way your assessment of improvisation sheds light on the artistic process of production, where normativity aspects of improvisation are not prominently at play?
Yeah, thank you very much, Raphael. Now it would be interesting to really be able to speak with one another, since it's not at first sight evident to me what you mean by normative aspects of improvisation. So I spoke about the normative aspect of improvisation. Let's assume that you mean that, so that you in that way make reference to my considerations about improvisation. And I would say that what is important to my understanding of these normative aspects of improvisation is that we have the very same thing if we have, for instance, how I analyzed paintings of Manet and their influence on social practices of seeing, for instance. So that we, let's say, for instance, that could be controversial, but let's say it just for the sake of the argument, or for the sake of the explanation, that Manet's paintings are about the problems of individuals who don't find a place within society. So, and that is reflected in Manet's painting, that we don't see the eyes of the individuals proper. So it's so we see individuals which are lost with their gaze in social structures. And this, I would say, is something which can be, as a reflection of modern life, have a normative impact on the development of social practices further. So the normative aspect of improvisation in that sense is reflected with regard to artistic practices in the way that artistic works like the paintings of Manet can have an effect of making people in modern life aware of the structures of modern life. In that sense, building up a norm of self-understanding ourselves within a modern situation, a situation of a modern society. So this means that the normative aspect I would not only see in artistic production, firstly, but I would more try to explain how specific impulses and interventions which artworks realize come to be effective in the social world, and thereby setting up new norms, for instance, of a social self-understanding, like I've tried to explain it now. Maybe we leave it like this, Miguel, as a first attempt to answer.
Okay, thank you. You can return to this if you want. We had already another question from Professor Paola Jacques, also from Federal University of Bahia. I will try to translate it. Actually, she said, in Brazilian cities, the improvisation is part of everyday life, especially in popular areas. They are always collective actions, as in the favelas.
Collective actions?
Yes, collective actions, as in the favelas or slums, né? And doing so by necessity and contingence. And then she's asking you how this popular of a way of dealing of everyday life can be better approximate to your theoretical perspective, yeah? Because she sees that there is also a kind of organization inside this chaotic environment, so that they can build collectivity without a program effectively. Yeah? So how can you approximate or say something about this context for us now in Brazil?
Yeah, thank you very much, Paola, for this interesting question. I hope that I get it the right way by answering it in the following way. So, a twofold answer. The first step of the answer is to say that I find it very interesting that you mention popular cultural ways of improvisation as being relevant to societies and to what you say about Brazilian societies, but I would say that there are other societies I can think of where the very same holds in the end. And I would say that lots of parts of common forms of life is improvisational in nature. So, and what I tried to explain that has been part of a question, and I wanted to reflect together with you is that we can only think of art as being really a part of human practice if we think of human practice as being basically improvisational. And sometimes this improvisational aspect of human practice is not easy to grasp. But the movements you mentioned seem to make it more easy to grasp the improvisational aspect of human practice. And so I would say that basically all everyday practices I can think of are at least in some way to be understood as being improvisational. And so I think that is could be a first important lesson of what you mentioned. And the second aspect I would like to stress is that I think that movements like this, if I get that right, so movements, popular movements in poor parts of cities, of big cities like the favelas or so, that these movements to build up and to bring together people use aesthetic strategies often. So that is has just been one of the reasons that I mentioned, for instance, the Shibuya crossing and the Japanese everyday culture. So an improvisational practice, a practice without strict regulation, but nevertheless being very successful in synchronizing individuals and doing so there again and again every day. And it's part of everyday Japanese culture to succeed in improvising again and again ways of hundreds of people crossing a street at the very same time without hindering each other. And so I think that the movements you mentioned would be interesting to analyze them with regard to the aesthetic strategies which are in play informing just the collective you speak about. And in that way, I would at least be interested in the question in which way this improvising community you speak about is at least somehow bound up with aesthetic structures and aesthetic practices. And I think I would think that it is very probable to find aesthetic structures and practices within that. Now I can't hear you, Miguel.
Sorry, I forgot the microphone. Thank you very much. Look, we have another question. This one from Rodrigo Duarte, professor at the Federal University of Minas Gerais. He says, thank you for the inspiring lecture. Do you think that Adorno's idea of formal law excludes a possible dialogical interaction between artistic and audience?
Yeah, thank you, Rodrigo. That is a question I understand very well, and it's clear. I take your question to be rhetoric in nature, and that means it's clear that you are right. in pointing to the fact that Adorno's concept of mimetic practices can be understood as entailing some dialogical aspect of interaction. But it's clear that Adorno is not that clear in this regard. So we can read Adorno in different ways, and one way would stress more that it's important for him that there is so the receiving subject, so the subject which deals with the artwork, or subjects in the plural which deal with artworks, that they don't act on their own. This is very important. So in a way, the artwork acts through them. And this is important for Adorno, since he thinks that only in this way the structure of identification on which the subjects belong can be broken up, at least in some regard. So I think what one can stress in Adorno that he points more to the passive aspect of mimetic practices, just for that very reason, since he thinks, or he assumes, that activity always belongs to some at least to somehow structures of identification, and in that regard belongs to a structure in which the subject is not transcended enough, to put it like this. But it's clear that is so. If one wants to make Adorno's position stronger, it's clear that you would have to stress more, at least in my perspective, to stress more this dialogical aspect and the aspect of activity on the recipient side, on the receiving subject side as well. Maybe that for the I leave it like this for the moment.
Thank you, Georg. I'm seeing, following here, the chat. We don't have any question at the moment. Maybe I could put you another one, so then we have some time to wait for maybe the last one. Let's see if the audience will be able or encouraged to do that. Let's see. But I saw that you offered, or you're proposing, a unified aesthetics for the arts, because you put examples from all kind of all kind of arts. But you also are interested in unifying aesthetics to comprehend the everyday life and culture as well. And then my question, with this big perspective, are you not so connected with some metaphysical heritage? I mean, you are not so taking too much this big pretension, so then being side by side by what so many authors you deal with criticize.
Yeah, thank you, Miguel. That's a very important question, if I get that right. Yeah, and it's clear. So maybe the first impulse to answer your question would be to say, why should I be in sorrow of metaphysical heritage? So in a way, it's clear that so the last question of Rodrigo's has been making reference to Adorno, and it's clear that thinking of Adorno in the last part of Negative Dialectics, Adorno reflects on, in a way, the necessity of metaphysics. So the meditations on metaphysics, even though it's clear that Adorno is very critical of a specific tradition of metaphysics, he thinks that it's not possible to give up metaphysics as a whole. So the project of metaphysics is important for us. And why is it important for us? Since metaphysics is about the very idea that what we are in a present moment is not everything. Yeah? So that what we have reached as human form of life, and within a human form of life, is not everything that we have. So there are points of transcendence which are relevant for the practices we are in. And this should be developed according to Adorno's perspective. And I think he's completely right as to art, to think of art as a practice where these points of transcendence again and again come into play. But so the attempt of this unified account you speak of in aesthetics is to spell out in a concrete way what that could mean, that transcending moments are realized through artworks, through artistic performances, through artistic practices again and again. So they are realized in forms of tiny impulses, in forms of tiny or not that tiny, think again of the architecture examples or the films of Lars von Trier, of interventions. So they do interventions by challenging us in our practices, in our ways of feeling, in our ways of speaking and behaving towards each other. They challenge us and thereby give us again and again impulses to transcend a specific way of practice we are accustomed with. And that is the general attempt. So I think you're completely right. I think that it's important to give an account of the basic idea of what's art's place in the human form of life is. Even though you are completely right that it should not be uniform in the end. So even though it's a unified account of how to make sense of what art is about, and that I would like to spell out with Adorno, it's clear that it can't be a uniform account. So they are very different forms, and that I wanted to stress too with the different examples. So the examples should not be read as saying that it's all and again the same, but that it's different. So it's very different in Japanese everyday culture as it is, for instance, in a painting of Manet, and the way an intervention is realized makes something very different in these different contexts and in the different ways art is performed, art is realized within a specific historical cultural situation. Nevertheless, there is a common basic idea to which all these practices make reference. And this is the idea of, I spelled it out in terms of self-destabilization. So there is some sort of dealing with ourselves without being too sure who we are. And this is what art is about in all cultural situations I can think of, even though realized in very different ways. So that is the structure of the idea, even though I completely understand that you are skeptical about, but I wouldn't accept so I'm not basically skeptical about metaphysical heritages. I think we should more think that it's necessary to deal with them, and we can't get rid of them in the end.
Yes, thank you. I'm agree with you at the end. I think metaphysical perspective have many things to help us. Look, we have a last question. This one from Mônica Nogueira from the Universidade de la República in Uruguay. She says, thank you for the lecture. How do you evaluate the impact of institutional practices of autonomous art on the success or failure of these improvisation practices? That will be the last question. Then after that, we can close the transmission, but be calm and use your time.
Thank you, Monica, for this interesting and excellent question. I hope that I understand the question right, but I think it's very important to think, to put it like this, about the dialectics of artistic impulses and how this dialectic relates to problems and opportunities of autonomy of art, to put it like this. Yeah. So, and it's clear that so the problem so we have both a problem of institutional practices of autonomous art and an opportunity of these institutional practices. And the problem could be explained in the following way. In practices where art is more and more detached from forms of everyday life, art tends to lose its power to really realize impulses. So, and in that sense, the idea to form institutions and have institutions in which the autonomy of art is safeguarded can be problematic. But at the very same time, it's important that art has free space to develop impulses and in that sense to develop interventions. In that regard, we need institutional practices of autonomous art to really further develop art and its potential within society. So I would, if I get that question, I hope that I get the question right, I would say that even though we have to reflect what I try to explain as the problem of these institutional practices of autonomous art, it's important to have these institutions and to have institutional means to further develop art and not lose it within, for instance, a technological society. So in that regard, I think it's very important to think about public money for art and about the ways in which a society and in which political spaces allow art to develop and in the ways in which art is funded to further develop. This is, even though the problematic is in play, it's at the same time a necessary condition for the further development of art. And in that regard, I think that institution can be juxtaposed posited against improvisation here. So it's important for the improvisational impulses realized by art that they have some kind of institutional background, even though the problem I mentioned is in play. Maybe that is an answer for the moment. Thank you very much, Monica.
Yeah, so we are coming to the end. I pass you for the last words, if you want, Georg, and then I will close.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the excellent questions, and thank you for your attention. Once again, it would have been nice to be with you together in presence in Brazil, and I think discussion would have been more intense maybe if we would have the occasion to really meet in person. But I hope for another occasion, and in the moment it has been the best to do it this way. Here from my private office desk in Kreuzberg, Berlin, to Sao Paulo, or wherever you are in the moment in Brazil. And I wish you a very good continuation of your Congress. And thank you once again for your kind attention.
Thank you, Georg. It was a wonderful lecture, a wonderful discussion, many questions. That was very nice. Eu gostaria de agradecer a todos os presentes e finalizando aqui a nossa transmissão, dizendo que nós retomamos hoje à tarde com as mesas às 2 da tarde, né, às 2 horas, para os inscritos, e amanhã, de manhã, às 10 horas, nós continuamos com mais uma plenária. Muito obrigado e até breve.